Hi, this is James Warda, and welcome to another episode of Coincidental Conversations. Today we have a very special episode. I'm joined today by Jim Shull. He was a former executive creative director with Walt Disney Imagineering for over 33 years. And as a longtime fan and writer about Disney, you can probably tell that this is a thrill for me. So Jim, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Well, thank you very much, James, and thank you for reaching out. This is a pleasure.
So I'm going to start at the very beginning in Griffith Park in Walt Disney sitting on a bench. And as anyone who's probably familiar with Disney knows the story, but sitting on the bench watching his two daughters on a carousel and watching them, go round and round. And he started to think, boy, wouldn't it be great if there was a place where parents and children could go to have fun together? And, a kind of a simple vision, but a big vision. And it's always struck me how Walt's vision has been carried on throughout so many things of Disney. So I was going to ask you, as in your role with Walt Disney Imagineering, did you think about that? Was that in the back of your mind, just that you were helping this vision continue long past the time that Walt had passed away?
Well, that's an excellent first question. I didn't have it wasn't a top of mind because it's so much of my DNA. It didn't need to be a top of mind. I'm a child of Southern California. My yearly trips with my family were always down to Anaheim. And I was really enamored with Disneyland from the very beginning. So much so when I had my 7th birthday, I negotiated with my parents that I'd get to, instead of having a big birthday party at home, I could take one friend to Anaheim to Disneyland. I knew that's when I started learning about the art of negotiation and how to get your way if you want to do something. So I've always been a Disney fan first and foremost. Whenever I design with that 8-year-old to 12-year-old child that's still within me. And since then, I still think about the realities of money, schedule, budget, but they don't matter if you don't please the guest. And so the guest is always the first and foremost person I'm appealing to.
And because what you just said, that sounds like you obviously have a passion for it. Did you find with the other Imagineers, were they all also those 8-year-old children too? Did they all have that same kind of passion for what they were doing?
I would say for the most part, yes. And the people who didn't have that passion didn't stay within WDI, Disney Imagineering, for very long. And the reason for that is WDI is a world-class, one-of-a-kind organization. There's nothing, to my knowledge, on this planet that equals what they do. And I was fortunate to be part of that for over 33 years. But it's very hard work. You're doing one-offs, you're doing the first of something. And usually you spend between 3 and 5, up to 7 years dedicated to doing that full time. And I mean by that, it's not a 9-to-5 job. It's 60-hour, 80-hour weeks, Sundays, missing your family. It's a very difficult job. Having said that, it's a very rewarding job because when the project is completed, you've created the first of something. And to be number one is always it's just incredibly fulfilling, just to be able to say, I did this and I did it with a team of people and we worked together for years and we did something no one's ever done before. So the people who feel that way will work on a project and then do another project and another one, such as myself. And the people who don't feel that way generally don't stay. They'll do it for a while and then they'll go and do something easier at another company.
We were talking a little bit before we started recording, and we were talking about how I came to connect with you, and it actually started probably a few months back. We watched my wife and I watched the Imagineering story on Disney Plus, and this is not a promotional endorsement for Disney Plus, but I'm a big fan of Disney Plus. Anyways, and we watched the Imagineering story. And then we happened to go down and visit my son in Orlando. and we ended up going on two of the new, I know they're called rides, but often I just think of them as experiences, Rise of the Resistance, and then Flight of Passage in Pandora in the Animal Kingdom. I was on Flight of Passage and something very bizarre happened. I started to tear up. So I was looking around and I started to tear up, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm with my adult child here and my son, and I'm starting to tear up, and I'm 57. What is going on here? And it struck me that what had happened was Disney had created a sense of wonder for me, something we don't often feel as adults. And I came back and I wrote about it, and literally I must have gotten 60 to 70 comments from men and women who said the same thing. So I was going to ask you, when you were designing, when you and the Imagineers are you designing to evoke a feeling or emotion? Do you think you're going to, do you know when something's going to evoke wonder?
Wonder is really a hard thing to categorize. And I think generally that there are two types of experiences. I think there's a physical experience that we can have, and I think that there's a narrative experience that we can have. Pandora really did move me as well. In fact, so much so that even though I watched the movie Avatar, I was impressed by the technical expertise of the movie, but it did not move me the way that the Flight of Passage ride in Pandora moved me. And I sought out Joe Rohde, who was the creative lead for that project, after I returned from Orlando, and told him so. So, things don't need to be movie-based. You don't need to love the movie in order to love the attraction. I would point to Mr. Toad in Anaheim. Classic ride. Loved it. Wonderful little ride. Never saw the movie before I wrote it, but I didn't need to, because the story, the narrative story of the experience was so transcendent and immersive that I didn't need to rest upon the physical experience. When in Imagineering I would start on a project, I would always think about, what is my story? What am I trying to tell people? And I would meet with the project teams, which when we begin are very, very small. And one of my disciplines would be to say, let's start with this phrase, once upon a time. And if you start with once upon a time, there was Mickey Mouse and he lived in a suburban house outside of Anaheim. Well, that becomes Mickey's Toontown. Once upon a time, Andy was playing with his toys in the backyard before he left them to go to lunch. And that became Toy Story Land. Once upon a time, I wanted to be going to a rock and roll concert. And I was the biggest fan the band had, so they got me a special VIP limo. And that became Rock and Roller Coaster, and so on. When you start with a narrative thread and you establish it, and this thread is strong, and not every thread is, some of them break, and those are the projects that were never built. But when you have a strong narrative thread, it pulls the project through over the 2 to 7 years it takes to deliver it.
And is it hard to give up on a thread? Like, is it hard to admit when it's not quite strong enough? Is that a hard thing?
No, not really, because you get to the point where you realize internally, no, it's not a good story. It's not a strong story. Now, I would suggest there are projects, there are attractions that for various reasons, they've been announced, they're committed, they're going to open, the park needs them. For whatever reason, they build things that don't have a strong narrative thread. And that's always confirmed by the guest. And I'll stop right there, because ultimately the guest is the person I designed for, and the guest is the person who ultimately votes whether something is or is it not successful. I don't need to know. I could do all of the research information. I can skew information as much as I want to justify my position, but ultimately the guests will tell me whether something is successful or not. And so, like you and like me, I came back from Pandora, Flight of Passage, moved by an attraction whose narrative was based on a movie that really didn't speak to me. But that presentation did speak to me. When I worked on Toy Story Land, I thought there'd be only one. Well, there are 4 of them. So at some point, that narrative spoke to people. It spoke to Europeans. It spoke to people in Shanghai. It spoke to people in Hong Kong, very different cultures, but there was a common narrative thread that would appeal to each of those groups.
It's interesting because I would say the same thing about watching Avatar. I'm a science fiction fan, so it's a pretty amazing movie to watch, but not emotionally compelling to me. But then the ride becomes emotionally compelling. So when you talk to Joe about your reaction, what does an Imagineer do that takes something that's not emotionally compelling to create something emotionally compelling?
Well, I would always start with asking me, well, again, it goes back to me being that 8 to 12-year-old boy who is attracted to something. So I would ask, what resonates about the story to me? And let me be clear, there are times when executives have come to me over the decades and said, we want you to work on something. And I would say, no, that's really doesn't appeal to me. For example, if you asked me to do something in the realm of Tomorrowland, not really, I could do it, but it really doesn't appeal to me. Whereas if you're talking about realms of narratives built around fantasy or fable or classic tales or people or history, those are things that very strongly appeal to me. Cultural stories very strongly appeal to me. So those are things that appeal to me. Technology stories, not so much. So I would opt out of working on those projects that I know I couldn't give 100% to.
And because then how does Imagineering, how does the company handle that? Do they then assign by what people are passionate about?
There's what we would call casting, like in movie casting. And that's not a far stretch, because what was WED came out of the Burbank studio, and it was owned and operated by the Disney brothers. Although it was publicly a company, it was still Walt's studio. And it was a movie studio. And so when you do a movie studio, you develop stories, you have your creative team that would start to develop the stories, flesh them out. Then you'd have people who put together your movie budget, your set budget, your technology budget and crew, and you start to build a team that would deliver your movie. Well, since WDI WED came from that background, that history, that DNA, it's very much part of that. Now, the difference is that what WDI builds lasts for 20 years. The movie Avatar, #1 movie for a lot of time, many months, not in the movie theater today. Doesn't mean it was not a good movie today, still entertaining, but it's not in the theaters today. Whereas something Disney makes, like Avatar, or Pandora, that's been in Anaheim or in Florida for many years now. The Matterhorn in Disneyland Anaheim has been there since 1959. Few years based on a movie that most people wouldn't remember. And it was a minor movie, but they created an attraction based on a small movie that most people never saw. Most people don't know that there exists that film, yet it still entertained guests decades later.
I didn't know. I mean, I've ridden the Matterhorn. I didn't know it was based on the movie, which I guess goes along with what you were just saying. So you were saying a couple questions ago about how guests will tell you if a ride is good or not, right? How do you get that feedback? Do you watch them actually? Are you there on opening day of the ride, or do you listen to them? Do you just kind of hopefully you don't get recognized and kind of listen to what they're doing and watch how they react? How do you get that feedback?
Well, I am there opening day. I'm there during what we call a technical soft opening, when we start to invite cast members in to ride. We invite guests, paying guests to ride. And then, of course, on opening day, I'm there. But prior to that, even though I would be the creative leader, I would also engage all the other team members who weren't technically in the creative role. Because I think everyone brings to the table a viewpoint that's valid. And so I would talk to somebody who was in estimating or in financial controls or in scheduling and ask them and talk to them the same way as we're talking about narrative. What attracts them? What do they like? What do their children like? What do their grandchildren like? And just have this dialogue. But it's not a formal dialogue because, again, I've been part of focus group testing, and I'm not going to dismiss it completely, but my experience has been I can write any set of questions to support a previously held viewpoint. So rather than do that, I like to engage people in an ongoing narrative that's both inclusive and involving everyone, because you don't know. I mean, again, going back to culture, someone in China has a very different cultural viewpoint than someone in Anaheim. And so to bridge that group is a real chore, and it's kind of an unseen part of my job, but I would spend literally hours a day always benchmarking to ask myself, is this going to appeal? Because frankly, by the time, well before you open an attraction, I call it the army of construction goes to the site. And at that point, when they're digging dirt and laying pipes and pouring concrete, it's really too late to suddenly go, whoa, hey, wait, change my mind. I want it blue. I don't want it red. I want a flume ride. I don't want a roller coaster. It's too late to do that. So you really have to do due diligence for months or even years before that opening, when it's what I call it too late. You have to be very careful and be very cognizant and diligent and always thinking about the project. So.
When we used to take our kids when they were small, I'd always, we'd be in line and I'd always enjoy, like you could overhear the other guests, and the guests, you know, if you were at Epcot, the guests from around the world, all different cultures, all different languages, but all their kids were like, you know, fighting with each other, and, you know, the things that happen when you spend a long day at Disney World. And it really it kept striking me, you know, to paraphrase, to use a catchy phrase, how it's a small world. So if you design a ride internationally, you know, are the international guests, do you think they're going to experience the ride in the same way? Like if Flight of Passage is in another country, do you think they'll have that sense of wonder too? Have you found commonalities among people no matter where they live being an Imagineer?
Absolutely. You always find commonality. I mean, the reality is that people are people at their base. I think they're more affected by economics than anything else. Cultures are cultures. I'll give you an example of when I was explaining or pitching to Bob Iger Toy Story Hotel for Shanghai. You know, one of the concerns was Toy Story might's too young. And I explained it to Bob and the rest of his management team is I wanted to do something that was childlike, but not childish. And also the underlying idea behind Toy Story Hotel or even Toy Story Land that would appeal across cultures is that everyone is or has been a child. Doesn't matter whether you're living in California, Anaheim, Chicago, or Shanghai. Everyone is or has been a child. And secondly, everyone is or has played with toys. Now, if your economic status is different or less, you may be playing with a more simplistic toy. 40 years ago, I would be playing with, you know, more physical toys. Now we have virtual toys, laptop screens, iPads, other things, and that's our platform for play. Although I still see children playing with boxes, playing with string, playing with physical objects. Now, part of that is driven by, as they grow, they're starting to learn the physical limitations of their own body, and so they want to use their body to manipulate physical objects in a way that they can't manipulate a virtual object. So that appeals to them. And again, that appeals to playing with toys. And so the idea of playing with toys in China versus playing with toys in America was something that resonated. And that became an intellectual backbone to what we did in Toy Story. So those are two examples of how I think about design and how I think about how it would play to other cultures. And that is, the simple sermon is, find the commonality between the cultures and then continue to follow that line.
And the other thing that strikes me about, well, I'll use Rock and Roller Coaster as an example, and I'm a musician. There is something about that ride that is just really authentic about music and the band and being in a band. I can't even, if you ask me to say what it is exactly, I don't think I'd be able to put my finger on it. But there is something about that ride when you going, obviously the cues are very much a part of the ride when it comes to Disney and Imagineering. For Rock and Roller Coaster, did you spend a lot of time with, Aerosmith, with the bands, with like, how did you soak that in?
Well, it's interesting you said you're a musician, because I'm not.
Okay.
I couldn't sing, I can't play an instrument. I'm only a fan of music. And honestly, I'm not even that much of a fan of rock and roll music. But I am a fan of roller coasters, and I could see the potential of that idea of fusing rock and roll music to roller coasters, because roller coasters are about kinetic action and energy. Rock and roll music at its best is kinetic action and energy. Okay, so now we have a natural pairing. And then I thought, well, I'm not a musician, and I'm making the leap here of most people aren't musicians also. So what about this would appeal to people like myself or the others who maybe appreciate music, but don't play music? Now, the other thing is, people like myself who are not musicians, if you ask me, I'd be embarrassed to try to play an instrument or try to sing, because I can't do that. And then I extend that and think, well, most people or most of our guests also would be embarrassed. So how do I eliminate the potential for embarrassment? And I also think, well, I think most people will be interested in that world as I am. So let me take them to a place that they would not go because they have some fear about it. Maybe they're feeling awkward, they're not feeling confident. So let me take them to a place where they are going to be very safe. And so that started to become some of the threads, through lines for Rock and Roller Coaster. And talking to the band Aerosmith actually came late, because you don't really know who you're going to get until they're signed. And Disney talked to a number of bands, and you can't wait until you get the band signed before you develop the attraction, because again, it's the 3 to 5 year rule, 3 to 5 years to develop and open. So I was working well along on the idea and working in the design that the band would be dropped into it. But there again were certain criteria. So somebody had come to me, if the company had come to me and said, hey, great, we've got a country western band, probably not going to work. So no, can't do that. We've got to have rock and roll. Give me a classic hard rock and roll. Give me some music that breaks into songs that are 3 to 5 minutes that we can edit down. Okay, so that became a criteria. And it's interesting because you start to ask the questions in team meetings. We would create a matrix board of cards, storyboard cards. Imagine the wall behind me full of 3x5 cards, and they'd be rearranged on that wall during the course of the project. And they would always be something we refer back to, but they became a matrix and they became informative. And the reason those are important is over the period of the course of the project, different team members come in and out of the project. I, as creative, would always stay with the project, but others would come in and out. So you'd always have to have a storyboard or a matrix board. Think of it as a family tree. You always know who was your great-great-grandfather because his name is on that board. And so somebody just joined the project in year 4 would come to that family tree and go, oh, now I know what we're supposed to do because I can follow your logic. It's more than Jim Shull wants you to do this. There's a story logic that Jim Shull was part of a team that everyone bought in on. And that is what their role is part of delivery.
It's just amazing to hear the kind of thought and, thoughtful approach to these. If you're just a guest riding them, you just don't realize the layers. So there's the famous pictures of Walt Disney acting out stories, right? With or his animators. So with Rock and Roller Coaster, I know did you actually design the coaster itself, which would have its own story, right? I mean, a ride actually has its own arc. So
Yeah. I'm gonna step away.
Okay.
To get a prop.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, as I said, I'm really a fan of roller coasters. I ridden probably about 700-800 now. And I enjoy them. And as a result, I kind of know what does and does not work. And when it came time to do Rock and Roller Coaster, we wanted to do something that was unique and new. Wanted to do something very aggressive. Right now, it is still the fastest, most aggressive roller coaster that Disney's ever done. It has a very fast launch, the fastest launch. It has you go weightless in it, and there are 3 inversions. But there are certain things on a roller coaster you've got to have. You've got to have a steel track, you've got to have a seat, you've got to have a restraint system. So there are certain things you do. Now, when I started that project, yes, I followed it all the way through and I did the design. This is a toy of the design. So this is the front car of Rock and Roller Coaster. And I don't have my drawings here to share with you, but imagine you start with, I know there's a chassis here because the manufacturer told me there was. I know there are seats because the manufacturer told me there are. I know there are restraints because we're going upside down because it was, the manufacturer told me there are. So based on that, how do I make that look like a limousine? Because that's what I tell people that I want to build. So when you start with that, you have a front car. And again, it comes back to the through line. There's a narrative and it carries through. Now, the second thing about the roller coaster is it always has a rear car. And the rear car, gotta turn this around so it makes sense. The rear car is based on a classic 1960s Cadillac. And so what do they have? Well, they had tail lights, they had license plates, they had bumpers, stickers, and they had, most importantly, tail fins. So worked a lot with that, the idea of, well, there are tail fins on this roller coaster. How far can I get them extended out? Because there are reasons. But I really want to do tail fins. So starting with the design, it became probably a 2-year process going back and forth with the manufacturer where I do drawings, I do overlays on their engineering drawings. We would talk, we do the model. We did the model in Glendale, shipped it to the Netherlands where the manufacturer is located. They created the clay maquette. I would go there, I'd give them critiques and notes and even sculpt, because that's something I do as I sculpt and draw. And from there, we would do the first article in fiberglass, and then after that, create the 5 trains that are running around the track in Florida. But it's an iterative process, and again, it takes years to do it.
And I want to be really mindful of your time, so I just had a couple more questions.
I'm good with time.
Okay.
Don't feel constrained. You can edit this down to take out all the boring parts.
No, this is exciting. My son, I told you he was an engineer. He loves coasters. So he now lives, right like 10 minutes from Disney World. And he travels all around the country and Canada riding these coasters. So he's the one he's the one who will email me or text me or whatever, not email, he uses social media, about the new rides at Disney. And he's the one who told me about Flight of Passage and Rise, and his excitement and his passion for it. I see that in what you're talking about. What about with, just one more question on Rock and Roller Coaster, that's a synced up soundtrack.
Yes, it is.
How did you make that happen? Was that new when you introduced Rock and Roller Coaster, right? Or no?
No, Disney had done onboard audio. I believe the first onboard audio on a roller coaster was Space Mountain in Disneyland Paris.
Oh, okay.
However, I believe that was a single track when it opened, which means no matter how many times you wrote it, you'd only hear the same audio over and over again. Mm-hmm. Rock and Roller Coaster was different because there were multiple tracks, multiple songs. So if you wrote it 3 or 4 times, you'd potentially hear 3 or 4 different songs. Okay. Now, we would once we had Aerosmith, went through the Aerosmith catalog to find out, well, what are their classic songs? What are the songs that first everyone would know? What are the songs that everyone doesn't know them still sound catchy? What are the songs that we can edit down? Because remember, this roller coaster is only, a couple of minutes and that includes the point where you dispatch from the station, you move to the launch position, you stop there, then you're launched, then you're freewheeling through the roller coaster segment, then you come back to the brake zone before you enter the unload station. Not a lot of time. So we'd start with those classic songs, and then we would edit them down to fit the pacing of the coaster. And we had a virtual fly through the coaster, and we'd start to edit the songs to match the movements of the coaster, so that when Aerosmith, the band, came to Glendale to re-record the songs, they could match a timing sheet that we gave them. So we had a virtual fly through for them to look at. We spent time with them. I spent time with them talking about, this is what you're experiencing, this is what you're going to do, this is how you're going to feel things. And they were very enthusiastic. They embraced it very much. In fact, so much so that what we call Studio C, which is a pre-show in Orlando, when you look, there are a lot of studio props in that scene, and they actually are Aerosmith props. They gifted us those props. So those are authentic props from the recording studio, and they had their technicians come down, set up, and I worked with them to set up that scene to make sure that it was authentic and sincere, so that it felt as if they could step into that recording studio and actually do a real recording.
And that's why I was saying, as a musician, something about that ride and all the cue felt authentic. There you go. So what was it like when they wrote it the first time? What was their reaction?
They were blown away. I mean, they just, the guys just loved it. They loved it so much. They kept rewriting it. And, Perry had his children there, and they rewrote it over and over again. So, and I'll make a note here, this is a sidebar. As you can see, I wear glasses. So one of the criteria early on with Rock and Roller Coasters, I said, whatever you do, it has to be dynamic enough to be exciting, but not so dynamic I have to remove my glasses. Some coasters, they'll say, well, you have to take off your glasses to ride. And I go, no, can't do that. So that became a strong design criteria with our ride engineering team. And the second one is it has to be rideable. And by that, I mean, I have to be able to ride it, get off, and want to ride it again. And again, a lot of roller coasters, have the idea that they want the record for the most dynamic, most thrilling, most aggressive coaster. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted it to be fun, thrilling, but not terrifying. So the guys at Aerosmith carried that forward, and they really enjoyed it. In fact, so much more that when I wrote it first with our executive team, the president of Disney World, one of the funny stories was that he was talking to the senior vice president for that park, and they were doing a business meeting, waiting for in the load station to board the ride. They boarded the ride, stopped talking, rode the ride, got out, continued their conversation as if nothing had happened. Because they had just gone through this coaster that was going 56 miles an hour and upside down and weightless. It didn't upset them so much that they had to get their breath, they just got out and just kept talking as if nothing had ever happened. And they never meant that as high praise, but I took that as high praise.
You know, what's really unique too about that coaster, and my kids as they were younger, really, I don't know if they'd call it unique, but the launch sequence, you know, that anticipation it builds up is just tremendous, you know, with the music building and you're sitting there and the countdown. I'm sure you were thinking about all that too when you were designing that ride.
Yeah, you want to build a little anxiety. You want to build that moment of anxiety. Now, we do trade on the fact that we tell you that in Disney, you'll be safe. Disneyland, I believe a lot about safe journeys and safe returns. You're doing something, you're invited to do something that you want to do, but maybe you really wouldn't do it in real life. Let's take soaring, for example. Soaring is at different parks. You may not want to hang glide because of fear of your physical safety, but if I can tell you, oh, you can go and hang glide safely, oh, then people will want to do that. So it's about the promise that you will be protected and you'll return safely. And when you return, you'll learn something about your narrative that you've just experienced, but you'll also learn something about yourself. Because you might enter an attraction thinking, I don't know if I could do this. I don't know if I can go in a high-speed limousine or soar over the Andes. I don't think I can do that. But you find out, oh yeah, I can do that. And that becomes an important life lesson that people can carry out of the Disney attraction, where they go, well, if I can do that, what else can I do? And so people start to feel empowerment. And it's a subconscious thing you're playing this. I hopefully planted a seed that people can take with them, you know, throughout their life, thinking, well, gee, if I can do this, I can do something else. I can ski. I can learn a new language. I can enroll and become a master, get my master's degree. I can do whatever I want to do because I accomplished this. I rode a roller coaster.
Well, this has been great. I've just got two more questions for you. The second to last question is, you know, this is called Coincidental Conversations, because I'm always fascinated by behind every great story, there are coincidences, you know, that things could easily have gone this way instead of that way. You know, if Walt Disney had not sat on that bench in Griffith Park, might he not have envisioned Disneyland, right? So coincidences in your own life, do you ever look back and go, boy, that, you know, because that happened, I'm here, you know, like maybe people you've met. I know listening to some of the interviews with you in the past about, I think your dad had shirt boxes around the house that you started drawing on. A couple of coincidences that stand out for you?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I think that we are formed by our life experiences. As an only child who's had an issue with stuttering, I was very much more of an introverted child. We lived on a hill in the San Fernando Valley. There were 39 steps to the top of our front door. So we didn't get a lot of visitors. And my father, who was an executive in advertising, before that he was a professional photographer. He did a lot of glamour photography. He was the first person who did use of strobe in Los Angeles for glamour photography. But as he became more successful, he became an executive in advertising and was a partner in an advertising company in Los Angeles. So he was your typical 1950s, 60s madman, straight out of the television show. And so he had starched white shirts, and in them were these shirt cardboards. So, you know, that one man's trash is another man's treasure. And so I did these shirt cardboards and I would draw on them. And, you know, it was a way of expressing myself. And people would look at the drawings and go, oh, that's pretty good. That's not terrible for a 5-year-old, 6-year-old. That's pretty good. Then my father decided to build a swimming pool. Well, when you do that, you have sand. So one day a dump truck came up our driveway, up past the 39 steps, and dumped this mountain of sand in what was a vacant lot behind our house. Well, again, sand is a perfect tool to design and build. And because I love Disney, I started building the sand. And then again, art and negotiation, I convinced my father to give me a piece of his garage, and I built an HO train set. And I learned about rock work because I started developing it. I designed a cave, and I had small gauge wire, and I found that if you extrude plaster through the wire, you could create stalactites and stalagmites. And so it's not so much one straight line, it's accumulation of life experiences that then when the opportunity comes to use those experiences, I found myself in the right place. Because I do feel that I've been guided by three things. One, I have a lot of passion about what I do. I try to use what talents I have, and I try to always increase my technical expertise. You know, and I take those three items and I look for opportunities to use them. Since leaving Disney, I've started to do work for other companies. And that was kind of, I fell into that. I didn't really think about that. I just started to get these notes from people when they reach out to me and say, well, would you like to talk about this project? And if it's a project I like, I go, yeah, I'd like to do that. And so I've done some projects. Social media, I didn't really pursue social media until the last 6 months. And I have had a really good experience with it in general, especially when I talk to journalists like yourself who are not just after the next headline, but people who have journalistic ethics and standards. That's really good. And so these are not things that I started off in life thinking 30 years, 20 years ago, this is where I see myself in 2021. It just happens to be accumulation of life's opportunities and always saying yes to things that led me to where we are right now with you and I talking.
This has been tremendous. Last question. Walt is often quoted famously as saying, let's never lose sight of one thing. It all started with a mouse. If I asked you about yourself and your career, you know, and I said, if you could finish that blank for me. It all started with?
It all starts with a story. It all starts with a story, you know, and it doesn't matter what your story is or how long or how short it is or where you live or anything about you, but everyone has a story and every story is valid. So everything that I ever have done starts with a story, and anything that you talk about or your readers talk about, each one of them has a story. And I would encourage them in whatever form they want to pursue it, find their story, be brave to tell it, and pursue it.
Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your taking the time. I'm just going to take a moment here to thank our viewers. And I'm going to guess that you got a lot out of that as much as I did, because that was very powerful. And thanks again for joining us for Coincidental Conversations. Take care.